The director of the American Folklife Center here at the Library of Congress, and on behalf of all of the staff, I want to welcome you to the latest presentation in our ongoing Benjamin A. Botkin lecture series. Just a word about the lecture series. The Botkin series allows us at the Folklife Center to highlight the latest scholarship and the work of leading scholars in the disciplines of folklore, ethnomusicology, oral history, cultural heritage, and other related fields, while also enhancing our collections. And these lectures do some dual work for us. Most importantly, they are an important facet of our acquisitions. All of the lectures in the Botkin series are taped and will become part of the permanent collections. But in addition, all of the lectures here are also video recorded and will later be posted as webcasts on the library's website, enabling people around the world to sort of listen in on these wonderful lectures, but also to be available beyond this moment in time. So with all of that said, if you do have any cell phones on, please turn them off now. It would be greatly appreciated. And today we have a very special treat. I have the honor of introducing the internationally renowned folklorist Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett, who is the Distinguished Professor Emerita of Performance Studies at New York University, and also has served recently as chief curator of the core exhibition at the recently opened POLIN Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw. Barbara, or BKG as we all know her, has had an extraordinary career, as I think most everyone in this room knows. And in the interest of time, I'll try and be brief, but it's a longer than usual introduction for good reason. Originally from Toronto, BKG received her PhD in folklore from Indiana University and began a multifaceted career in both academic and public sector work. In addition to teaching performance studies at NYU since 1981, she has held faculty appointments at the University of Texas, Columbia University, and the University of Pennsylvania. Known for her interdisciplinary contributions, her scholarly areas of interest range far and wide, from Jewish culture to urban culture, popular and mass culture, performance studies and tourism, to ethnology, museums, folk art, and always food. We all love food. She served as the president of the American Folklore Society from 1991 to 92, and was the Society's delegate to the American Council of Learned Societies. She has served on innumerable boards, advisory boards, committees, editorial boards, including those for the Getty Institute for the History of Art and Humanities, the Smithsonian Institution, Stanford Humanities Center, the Association for Museum History, the I knew I was going to mess this up. The Schlesinger Library on the History of Women in America, the Association for Jewish Studies Executive Board, the American Center for Wine, Food, and the Arts, and the Social Science Research Council. In 2017, she received an honorary doctorate from the University of Haifa and was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. In 2015, she received the Officer's Cross of the Order of Merit of the Republic of Poland from the President of Poland. And she also received an honorary doctorate from the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, the Marshall Sklar Award for her contributions to the social scientific study of Jewry. And in 2008, she was honored with the Foundation for Jewish Culture's Lifetime Achievement Award, as well as the Motek Prize for Yiddish and Yiddish Culture, and was selected for the Forward 50, which celebrates leadership, creativity, and impact. I think you get the idea here. Lastly, Barbara's publications and media contributions have also ranged far and wide and are equally significant. Just a few highlights of some of her publications: Destination Culture, Tourism, Museums, and Heritage, The Art of Being Jewish in Modern Times, Museum Frictions, Public Cultures and Global Transformations, and Image It Before My Eyes, A Photographic History of Jewish Life in Poland, 1864 to 1939. Recently, she also produced a book, They Call Me Meyer, July, Painted Memories of Jewish Childhood in Poland Before the Holocaust. A lovely book which she co-authored with her father, the artist Meyer Kirshenblatt. I won't go into the films and on and on. In addition to this whole range of teaching, advising, and publishing, Barbara also has a long-standing interest in museums and exhibitions. She has served or is currently serving as a consultant and advisor for numerous museums, exhibitions, and cultural festivals. Among them, the Jewish Museum in Berlin, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and the Smithsonian here in DC, the Yeshiva University Museum, and the Jewish Museum in New York, the Skirball Museum in Los Angeles, the Jewish Museum in Vienna, and the Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center in Moscow. In 2006, after years of consulting for the new Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw, she agreed to lead the team developing the core exhibition, an enormous multimedia narrative experience dedicated to the 1,000-year history of the Jewish community in Poland. And it is that project at the Pauline Museum that will be the focus of Barbara's talk today. So I know I just took 10 minutes of your time, but please give a warm welcome to BKG for her talk, A Folklorist Tale, Stories of Tangible Culture, Intangible Culture, and the Politics of Culture. Welcome.
Thank you very, very much for that lovely introduction. I found it intimidating, but really very, very beautiful. And this is an extraordinary opportunity. I want to begin by thanking Nancy Gross for the invitation to come and to speak, and for her attention to every detail to really make this opportunity a very special and very memorable one for me. And I take the title of the talk, A Folklorist Tale, Stories of Tangible Culture, Intangible Culture, and the Politics of Culture. I take it very seriously. And so what I'd like to do is to answer the question, how is it that the organizers of this Museum of the History of Polish Jews, how is it that they hired, of all people, a folklorist to lead the development of a permanent exhibition about the 1,000-year history of Polish Jews? And I pose that to you as a question because when I was asked to lead the development of this permanent exhibition, one of our most wonderful donors looked at me and said, "What's your field?" And I said, "Well, folklore, anthropology, ethnography." "Oh," he said, "I know what this exhibition will be, teepees and feathers." And I was mortified. I was beyond myself. And, it'll be Fiddler on the Roof. It will be all shtetl. It will be everything that he hates. So fortunately, of course, it didn't turn out that way. However, what I want to do today is to reflect on what someone trained as a folklorist could possibly bring to a multimedia narrative exhibition of a 1,000-year history of Polish Jews, and why, when a folklorist comes to such a project, it will look the way it does and very different from if this exhibition had been created strictly by not only historians, but historians trained at Warsaw University, because that would have been, honestly, that probably would have been the option. So this is my starting point. This is Pauline Museum of the History of Polish Jews. We opened the building in 2013. We had the grand opening in 2014, and it faces the monument to the ghetto heroes. So I want to try to answer the question, I'm going to answer the question from 2 points of view. One is a personal point of view, and the other is a professional point of view. But from a personal point of view, I want to start by saying that I am the child of Polish Jews, that my parents were born and raised in Poland. My father, this is his passport, and this was issued to him when he left Poland to come to Canada in 1934. And my mother, he was born in Opatów in south central Poland. My mother in Brest-Litovsk. He came to Canada when he was 17. She was probably about 14 when she came to Canada. And I was raised in a Jewish immigrant neighborhood. And you get a little bit of an idea. I should confess that in the last few months, we've been moving from our home of 44 years. And you can imagine the accumulation. And the only good news about all of that was that in excavating 44 years of accumulation, I actually came across old photographs. And this is a kind of my way of signaling growing up in a Jewish immigrant neighborhood, surrounded by Yiddish speakers, and especially right after the Holocaust. I'm born in 1942 during the war, and I have very vivid recollections of DPs, displaced persons, that is to say Holocaust survivors, arriving and playing with the kids on the street. So I grew up in a very, if you will, Polish, Jewish, Yiddish-speaking milieu. So that would be the second piece of it. The third piece of it is that as a child, I went through a very, very Orthodox Jewish phase as a result of a terrible Jewish after school, if I may say. They were all awful. The first was the Farban Shula, the next was the Darcy Shula, the next was a Talmud Torah, and they were all really awful. But as a result of my brief period of strict orthodoxy, when I wasn't able to go to movies, tear paper, write, take a bus, anything, there was one thing I could do, and this is before the era of helicopter parents. I could walk by myself at the age of 10 to the Royal Ontario Museum, which I did every single Saturday. And it was only the permanent collection. There was no such thing as an exhibition, and there were no temporary exhibitions. And that was the beginning of my great love of museums. But the other moment had to do with the beginning of my PhD in the folklore department at Indiana University. Because in the very first semester, taking a fieldwork course in the folklore department with Jerry Mintz, he discovered that I knew Yiddish, and he said, well, why don't you do your fieldwork project on Yiddish folklore? So I went home, and I did. And I began interviewing my father. And I interviewed him for over 40 years. And I never stopped interviewing him. And being well-trained as a folklorist, I recorded those interviews. And moreover, when he retired and was at his sort of at loose ends, my mother and my husband, who's an artist, and I begged and pleaded with him for 10 years to paint what he could remember, and he did. And as a result, he really did the most extraordinary paintings. And so I would say that was another extremely important moment. 40 years of a conversation with somebody whose memory was bottomless, who remembered everything about growing up in Poland in the 1920s and 30s, and who then visualized it in hundreds of paintings and drawings. That was another element. Now, while that was happening at this very, very same time, I was at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, and I had the opportunity to work with Lucien Dobroszycki, a marvelous man, a survivor of the ghetto of Lodz, who had a PhD in history from Warsaw University. And he was a victim of the March 68 anti-Semitic campaign in Poland and came to New York without a word of English. And he was hired by YIVO to catalog their collection of almost 15,000 photographs of Jewish life in Poland before the Holocaust. And they asked me to work with him and to develop an exhibition, a book, and then eventually a film. And so as a result, at the end of that process, we opened it at the Jewish Museum in the 70s. I had an image bank. I had all my father's memories. I had an image bank of all of these black and white photographs. And I said to myself, and we published a book and we did the exhibition. I said, I got to go to Poland. And of course, before going to Poland, I had all my training and all of my academic preparation in folklore, in ethnography, in oral history, in Yiddish studies, in East European Jewish studies. So I was really ready for the next step. And so this is the kind of photograph that I knew from the YIVO collection, working with Dobroszycki, that we used this kind of material in before my eyes. So this would be market day in my father's hometown. And this is how he remembered the market in his hometown. And of course, this is market day, but of course not not as full as the photograph. And this is what it looks like today. because of course there are no market days today in these towns, but rather they've been turned into parks, basically. And so when I was invited to work on this museum, and it was an invitation, well, first of all, it began really as a phone call in 2002. Would I come to Warsaw and review the preparation for the creating of this museum? And I thought to myself, this is crazy. It's 2002. It's a decade after, a little more than a decade after the fall of communism. It's hard for me to imagine how it's possible. And I went, and I was very impressed with the plan. They had been developing and I'll explain in a moment the process, a master plan for the exhibition. And so I went, and then when the museum was founded, I was asked to lead the project. So I want to convey to you the nature of the project, but what I as a folklorist feel I could bring to it that I think, I hope, contributed to what makes it very, very special. And of course, I think of myself rather as an orchestra conductor, as a midwife, working with an extraordinary team of academics, curators, designers, and others. And so this is where this museum actually has been created. It's been created on the ruins of the Warsaw Ghetto, which was the pre-war Jewish neighborhood. And after the Germans suppressed the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, they leveled the whole area. And you can see in the background the leveling of 85% of the historical core of the city of Warsaw after they suppressed the 1944 Warsaw uprising. Now, when we had the grand opening, which was 2014, and that's when we opened the permanent exhibition, there was this comment by Arnie Eisen from the Jewish Theological Seminary. And it was a very moving comment for me and a very, very meaningful one. It's not often that a museum makes history as well as chronicles it. And rare, too, when otherwise cautious observers remark at the opening of a new museum that it may prove a source of hope and pride that propels an entire society forward. Both of those things happened this week in Warsaw with the opening of POLIN Museum. Now, there are several things here that were very, very meaningful for me. Otherwise cautious observers is an understatement, because, in fact, there was great skepticism about this project for many reasons. American Jews thought it was a Polish state's plan to whitewash the history and extract tourist dollars. And Poles thought it was going to be a museum of the history of anti-Semitism and blacken the good name of Poland. And there were others who thought it was an unrealistic project that could never be completed. So cautious observers is really an understatement. But the second is the idea that it was that the creation of the museum was in and of itself making history as well as chronicling it, and that it could actually make a difference to the wider society. And I like to think of that not only as Poland, but also the wider society more generally. And that's something we maybe can take up a little bit later on. So the museum, as you saw from the very first image, faces the monument to the ghetto heroes. And this photograph is from 1948. And what it's showing you is the unveiling of the monument on the sort of this mound of the rubble, because by 1948 it was the 5th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, but it was only a couple of years after the war, and there's a path that's been cut through, but you can see that people have to climb up the rubble to get to the monument, and it took decades to actually clear the rubble and to flatten the area. And in the back you can see this destroyed city of Warsaw. So the decision as to where to put the museum. Well, first of all, because virtually almost nothing, there's almost no material trace of the vibrant Jewish community of Warsaw, the largest Jewish community in Europe, and for a time, the largest Jewish community in the world. There's almost nothing to indicate that such a community existed, except maybe for the Jewish cemetery in Warsaw. But that means that since 1948 and until the museum opened, perhaps the most iconic marker was in fact this monument, the monument to the ghetto heroes, showing the fighters on one side and the Great Deportation on the other, and surrounded by communist-era apartment blocks in a very sleepy, part of the city. It's still the central city, but these communist era apartment blocks this really gives you a feeling of there are no cafes, there's no lively street life, there's a plaza, there's a park. But when the decision was taken to actually try to create this museum, the city allocated the land facing the monument, which was the perfect location for this museum. And the museum itself, as an idea, it arose in 93, but it wasn't actually founded until 2005, and that's when the architectural competition was organized, and the winner was a Finnish architect who created a building that was, by the rules of the competition, not higher than the communist era apartment buildings around it, and had to be able to sit within this residential neighborhood. And here you can see the building from the other side of the monument, which is the side that shows the great deportation of 300,000 Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto in the summer of 1942 to the death camp in Treblinka. The museum's name, Pauline, comes from the Hebrew word for Poland, and it would be Pauline in Hebrew, and it would be Poilin in Yiddish. And this is silk-screened on the glass, I would say almost like scales on a fish, that line the outside of the wall in Hebrew and in Latin letters, and I'll explain in a moment why that name. But this beautiful building of glass is really, I would say, an architecture of hope on a site of tragedy. And it just shimmers in the light, and it is open and transparent, and it's reflective. And it really, I think, as architecture, communicates what this museum is all about. And all the drama is on the inside, using a technique called shotcrete, shooting actually a mixture of concrete and quartz crystals from a hose onto netting over an armature. And it's created the most dramatic and marvelous interior. But what that does is it allows the exterior of the building to stand in a proper relationship to the monument, which was also one of the rules of the competition. Now, at the heart of the museum, and of course the area that I worked on, is the multimedia narrative exhibition. And the minute you say narrative, you're talking to a folklorist. It's all about storytelling. And if there's anything that modern museums have learned, and that is that they're not really an ideal medium for communicating information, but that the single best way to communicate with a visitor is through storytelling. And that is through those small stories that you can create a big story. And it's through storytelling that you can make sense, and it's through storytelling that you can create an experience that is memorable and is emotional and is thought-provoking. And so I felt like I was in my element. I had written my doctoral dissertation on storytelling in the Toronto Jewish community. I had studied narrative up, top to bottom, the semiotics and structuralism and you name it, sociolinguistics, ethnography of communication, whatever there was to think about storytelling, whatever tools I could possibly have, I feel as a folklorist, I got them in spades. And I was able to bring that feeling, that sense of storytelling and the power of storytelling to the creating of this museum. And so we enter the museum from the main hall down a set of stairs, and we come into what I think of as a theater of history. And that is that this is a museum that began without an historic building, without an historic neighborhood, without a collection. But its single greatest aspect was intangible. Its single greatest aspect was its story. And they started with the story, and it was the challenge was how to communicate that story in a really powerful way using the medium of an exhibition. And so, of course, we showed objects, we used objects, and the single most important collection of such objects is at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. But this collection, like almost all collections of Jewish material related to the history of Polish Jews, it's 19th and 20th century. It's largely art and Judaica, photographs and memorabilia. There's virtually almost nothing from the medieval period. There's very little from the 16th, 17th centuries. You're lucky if you can find some Judaica from the 18th century. And so the idea that you could create a compelling 1,000-year story based on a collection was out of the question. And so since the story was primary, and since reaching our and communicating with our visitors was primary, we had to do something else. So just a quick idea of the unique circumstances around the creating of this museum. So the idea in 1993 was prompted by the opening of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum here in Washington. And the thought was that if there's a Holocaust museum in Washington, there should be a museum of the history of Polish Jews in Warsaw. And the project, I would say the idea became a formal project in 1996, and it was initiated by the Association of the Jewish Historical Institute of Poland, which is a Jewish NGO established in 1951 in Poland. And it wasn't until, and of course, the story being all they had, it was the developing of the permanent exhibition that the association dedicated itself to, literally from 1996 until 2005. So for over 10 years, that's all they did, was to work on developing the basis for and then the actual master plan. The 2005, the museum's founded. There's the competition. There were over 200 entrants with about 11 finalists, and among them Daniel Liebeskind. And the architects like to say that the best prize is second prize, because you get the prize and you don't have to build it. So I'm not so, I'm not so sure that some of these famous architects, and they had, marvelous projects, but not for this site. Daniel Liebeskind, it was an open book with these pages like wings. It was just, can you imagine that with this communist era architecture in this residential neighborhood? Out of the question. So then we opened the building, we had the grand opening, and then in 2016, it was the first time any museum in Poland had won these awards, the European Museum of the Year Award, the European Museum Academy Prize, and no museum in Europe had ever won both prizes in the same year, although I have to say that the European Museum Academy was a little miffed, and they said, oh my God, if only we had known that you got the other award. And I thought, good that you didn't know. So we got both of those. And then as of now, since we opened, we've had about 3 million visitors, which is really very, very exceptional. I would say only paralleled, and we're speaking now not about Holocaust museums, but about Jewish history museums. I would say the only comparable museum of that scale would be the Jewish Museum of Berlin. So it's really quite exceptional. So coming to this as an academic, not as someone who worked her entire career in a museum, and working with an international team of academics, we developed a set of principles that would guide the creating of the narrative. And it was very, very important to us that we have a kind of consistent and coherent approach to the overall historical narrative and also to the way in which we would tell it. This was really important, so that it wasn't like the designers come in, you give them the stuff, they come back to you with a design, and it's a kind of a mix of a little bit of this and a little bit of that. No. So the first was to declare clearly and strongly that the single most important period in the history of Polish Jews is 1,000 years. Not the Holocaust, not the post-war years, not the interwar years, pardon me, and of course nobody ever said the medieval period, which is more than 500 years. But and our medieval historian used to always complain. She said, I've got more than half the millennium and nobody's interested. But as it turns out, actually it's one of the most interesting and most appreciated of all of the sort of 7 historical galleries. The second was that Jews are an integral part of the history of Poland, that they're not only in Poland, but also of Poland. And the idea of an integral history was very important to us. The third is that we would focus or structure our narrative around what we called a spectrum of relations, because there was an assumption that the single most important relation and the determining relation in this history was the relation of was anti-Semitism. And we said, no, pardon me, this is a story of coexistence and conflict, cooperation and competition, separation and integration, inclusion, exclusion, and it's a spectrum. Sometimes one of those terms is in the foreground and other times another. A fourth principle was that Jews created a civilization that is categorically Jewish and distinctly Polish. Excuse me. And that this community became the largest Jewish community in the world and a center of the Jewish world. By the 18th century, half the Jews in the world were living in this territory. That is the territory of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which includes today Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, and surrounding areas. And that's 750,000 Jews. That was half the Jewish population of the entire world was living here. And there's no way that the population would grow to that extent and that there would be a continuous Jewish presence across 1,000 years if this was essentially a history of anti-Semitism. And then the power of telling the story in the very place where it happened, which might seem obvious, but I cannot tell you how many people say to me, why are you making this museum in Poland? I said, well, where should we make it? They said, you should make it in Tel Aviv, or you should make it in New York. You should make it where the Jews are. I said, we're going to bring the museum to the Jews. No, we're going to bring Jews and everybody else to Poland. And the power of telling this story in the very place of this story, that is incomparable. There is nothing to replace it. And so, like a good folklorist, we begin the 1,000-year history of Polish Jews with a legend. And it's the legend of Pauline. And we use a very beautiful retelling of the legend by Agnon, the Nobel Prize winner for Hebrew literature. And the legend goes something like this. Jews in Western Europe were being persecuted. They fled east. They found themselves in a forest. And then, of course, there are versions and variants. And according to one version, the clouds broke and an angel's hand pointed, and they heard the words, Pauline. According to another version, the birds were chirping, Pauline. In another version, there were pages of the holy texts were floating down, or they saw Hebrew words carved on the trees. But when they heard the words Pauline, they thought they heard Hebrew. Pauline, rest here. And so they said, it is divinely ordained that we should stay here until the Messiah comes and we are taken to the Holy Land. And so they say, that's how Poland got its name. We know that. Maybe the others don't, but we know how Poland got its name. And indeed, Pauline and Poilin are the Hebrew and Yiddish names of Poland. And so what we did was to create this very poetic, very evocative forest inspired by the UNESCO World Heritage Site in northeastern Poland, which is this marvelous primordial forest. And we then retold the legend in this space. And so our visitors actually begin in a space, in a very poetic space, a space of historical imagination, where you have the sort of a sense of how Jews are trying to explain to themselves how they came to Poland, and that they should explain it in such a positive way is a very counterintuitive way of beginning this 1,000-year story. Now we come to the medieval gallery. The moment that we enter the medieval gallery, we cross a threshold between legend and history. Now, what do we have to work with for this over 500-year period, from 960 to 1507, more or less? There are exactly two kinds of objects for this period that are directly connected to Polish Jews, Jews in Poland. Tombstones. This is the earliest Jewish tombstone from Wrocław. It's 1203. And bracteates, one-sided coins that actually have Hebrew inscriptions on them, that were either minted by Jews or minted under their supervision. That's it. And of course, they're not that big. They're the size of a dime. And a 500-year story made out of tombstones. Of course, we can't bring all these tombstones into the gallery anyway. And out of little tiny coins, no way. So what did we do? What we did was this. Our greatest asset in this entire exhibition is intangible. It is the stories that we're able to glean from sources like rabbinical correspondence, travel accounts, chronicles, legal documents, religious texts, from any one of any number of texts, and it's those stories that are our bread and butter. They are our artifacts. They're intangible, but we think of them as our artifacts. And so we went to our medieval sources, to these travel accounts, to these rabbinical correspondence where one rabbi is writing another rabbi, I have this dilemma, give me your advice. And those letters were actually compiled. So we've got access to them. So we got the stories from there that refer to these Jewish traveling merchants and what was going on in the Wild East in the medieval period. And then we took illuminated manuscripts from the Ashkenazi communities in the Rhineland, which is the area, the region from which Jews came to Poland. And we gave them to two of Poland's most celebrated comic book artists. And we said to them, illustrate the stories. And then we asked three church conservators of Polish churches, to actually hand paint the walls with those illustrations, and they are in a style that changes from century to century to century. And the result, and we also had a gilder actually gild with real gold the sections that deal with the what we call royal relations, and the result is a hand-painted gallery. So this is a gallery in a multimedia narrative exhibition. You expect all high-tech and immersive and whatever, and here you've got a handmade gallery, which is like an illuminated manuscript that is life-size and 360 degrees, and you're actually inside it. And so here, in the absence of, or in the presence of tombstones and coins, we actually have something very, very startling. And so we've organized it in that way, and of course we provide interactive opportunities to dig deeper into the story. When we move from the medieval period to the early modern period, we move to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and let me just show you the map. And this now is the territory at its largest. It is, Ukraine has been absorbed into Poland in the medieval period, and now Lithuania joins, and they form the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And this is a period that both in, I would say, Polish history and Jewish history is treated as something of a golden age. And, of course, golden age is a trope, but what's interesting here is that during this period, there was a lampoon, and in many versions and variants, which basically criticized everything about Poland. And among what they criticized was what they said, Poland is a paradisus Judaeorum. It is a Jewish paradise, which was a criticism. In other words, Jews had it too good. And so we take this paradisus Judaeorum as a kind of ambivalent with a question mark, but they also say that the nobility are no good and the clergy are no good and the foreigners are no good and everybody's no good and everything's wrong with the Commonwealth. And so you can see it, you probably can't read it from there, but I can maybe read it from here. It says here, the Polish burghers, let's see here. It's paradise for the Jews, hell for the peasants, purgatory for the burghers, and it is rule by servants. And it's a bit like the criticism of immigrants, etc. But what did we do? We created, and this is a hallmark of the exhibition, we created a multi-voiced narrative, not a single voice, and everything is in what I call, in quotation marks, the first person, meaning that as much as possible, we drive the narrative through quotations from primary sources from the period, and we try to keep our visitors inside the moment of the telling of the story. And so here what you have is a quotation from the great Rabbi Moses Isserles, who says basically things here aren't as bad as they are in Germany, and may it stay that way. In other words, he had very low expectations, but this is the early modern period. This is what religious toleration looked like. And we have a Karaite, and we have a nobleman, and we have those that are for and those that are against, and it's a kind of a chorus of voices, and the whole exhibition is organized around that principle of multiple voices, primary sources, all from the period itself, and in what we would call the historical present. Now, we wanted to communicate some very abstract ideas, and in this section of the early modern period, meaning 16th and 17th centuries, one of the big ideas is that the center of the Ashkenazi world has shifted from the Rhineland to Poland. And why? For two reasons. One, because Poland becomes renowned as a center of rabbinical authority, scholarship, printing, and because there was a very high degree of Jewish self-government. Those are extremely abstract ideas, very difficult to communicate in an exhibition, and we decide to do it through a history of printing in the earliest Yiddish printed books and very, very early and important printed Hebrew books. And to make it as impactful as possible, it turned out that manual interactives are far more effective than digital ones. And here what we did is to create 4 printing presses. They were initially intended for kids, but adults love them too. And so you've got our visitors are printing title pages, printers' marks, etc., framing them, taking them home, hanging them on their walls. If you can imagine, all over Poland, you have these Yiddish printed and Hebrew, printed elements, which I find absolutely extraordinary. But of course, we also wanted to open those books up, which we do digitally, and to interpret them, including a wonderful Kabbalistic scroll that had never been shown before. And we break the period and treat as a caesura the Khmelnytsky uprising of 1648, and that brings us into the second half of this Commonwealth period, where we zoom in on everyday life in what we call the Jewish town. The most characteristic form of Jewish settlement in this territory were towns, because Jews were always settling in towns and in cities. They weren't agricultural. They managed agricultural assets like farms and villages and mills and fisheries and forests, but they lived in the town and they were the economic engine of the noble estates. And here is a wonderful opportunity to capture everyday life, because one of the hallmarks of this exhibition is its emphasis on ordinary people, everyday life, social history, cultural history, not only the elites, but also the everyday people. And I think probably the most dramatic expression of something that folklorists would appreciate, especially, is the way we dealt with a completely lost object. And so let me just take you through this. Some of you may have seen Raise the Roof. How many saw Raise the Roof? A few people saw it. It's now available, I think, for streaming, but I really recommend it. It's a wonderful film, and you'll understand why in a moment. So we wanted to communicate in our Jewish town that there were two centers of gravity. There was the marketplace, and then there was the synagogue. The marketplace was about economics. It was about Jewish interaction with their neighbors. Around the marketplace, it'd be a tavern, a church, a town hall, homes, and that would be one story. And then there was the synagogue and all of the Jewish communal buildings around it, and that was another story. And we always felt that one of the most unique features, if you will, of Polish Jewish civilization was the wooden synagogue. It, of course, shares architectural forms, and it shares building techniques and iconographic and other techniques with its surroundings, whether they're Ukrainian, Lithuanian, Polish. But the actual ensemble is a really uniquely, I would say, distinctly, categorically Jewish, distinctly Polish, Ukrainian, Lithuanian object. Now, there were about 200 of the great wooden synagogues in this territory. I would say they were the ones that are from the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. There were about 200 of them. And during with the outbreak of the war and during the war, the Germans destroyed all of them. Not one of them is still standing. However, during the 1890s and especially up to World War I and during the 20s and 30s, there was a kind of, I would say it's like an arts and crafts movement, but it was a preservationist movement, and there was an interest, a kind of discovery of this vernacular architecture and an appreciation of it, and then a concerted effort to document it. And it so happens that there was one of these synagogues, the one that once stood in Gvozdets, which is today in Ukraine, that is the single best documented of all of the wooden synagogues, and it happened to be destroyed in World War I when the Russian front moved through Gvozdets. But the documentation began in the 1890s, and it continued with the materials incredible, not only photographs, but also architectural drawings, cross-sections, cutaways, floor plans, measurements, photographs, and paintings. This is a painting of the interior of that synagogue from about 1897, and this is Isidor Kaufmann, a Jewish artist living in Vienna, who used to spend months in the sort of rural part of what's called Galicia, the partition of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and this is his painting of one section of that interior. He also painted a section of the interior of a nearby wooden synagogue that had been done by the same artist. So we have some color references. So what do you do when you're dealing with a lost object? We worked with a educational studio in Massachusetts called Hans House Studio, and their mission is to recover lost objects. 3 words, recover lost object, captures perfectly what they're about. And what they say is, you can never recover the original object in the sense of the original material. So you can never recover it in the sense of what was tangible about it. But you can recover the knowledge of how to build it by building it using traditional tools, materials, and techniques. In other words, you can recover the intangible heritage. You can recover something that is of enormous value, but in order to recover it, you actually have to do something tangible. And the outcome is an object, but it's not a copy, a facsimile, a replica, a reconstruction. I absolutely categorically, I can't even believe I uttered those words. I categorically reject that terminology, because it is an actual object. It is a new kind of object, and its value lies in the way it was created and in the knowledge that was recovered from creating it. And I think of it as a very Japanese approach. In other words, there are shrines in Japan that claim to be 800 years old and never more than 20 years old, because every 20 years they tear it down in order to have to rebuild it, because it's only by rebuilding it that they can transmit to the next generation how to do it. And what they value the knowledge of how to do it more than they value the original material. So this is intangible heritage on steroids. It is the gold standard for in a sense, not only the recovery of intangible heritage, but also the relationship between the role, if you will, or the relationship between intangible and tangible. That is what's so absolutely brilliant. So what did we do? We went to the open-air folk architecture museum just outside of Sanok in the south of Poland, and they were really great in collaborating with us, and they allocated a big, huge piece of their territory. They said, okay, you can make your wooden synagogue here. And of course, I wanted to do it 100% scale, the whole synagogue. It's not that big to start with, but my museum director said it was too much. So I settled for the roof and the painted ceiling, 85% scale. So we then ordered 200 logs with the bark still on. And we collaborated with the Timber Framers Guild of America and with other timber framers in Europe. And these timber framers, they're maniacs. They come with they will go anywhere to timber frame. They bring with them their historical axes and adzes and lathes and pit saws and every imaginable tool. They brought them in golf bags and ski bags on the airplane. I don't know how they did it. And it was like Lord of the Rings. Oh my God. How could you mix those two things up? Well, maybe under certain circumstances, you know. And we put together a team of volunteers, and these volunteers, often students, had never ever picked up a saw, a hammer, or anything in their lives. And the whole idea was that it would be also, because Hans House Studio is an educational project, and it is very Dewey. It's very learn by doing. And so this is a pit saw. And then in the course of 3 2-week workshops, we completed all the timber framing. And so this structure, this is the roof structure, is held together by wooden pegs. And it is, at the end of the 6 weeks, we pulled the pegs out, numbered all the parts, put them under a tarpaulin, and let them sit out there for almost 2 years until we were ready to bring all the pieces to the museum. And then, and you can imagine with these beams what it was like. And I mean, I photographed the whole process of bringing these beams into the museum and lowering them without destroying the building. Then that was really something. And so what we did then was take all the pieces, put them back together again, and we hoisted this structure. And fortunately, we had come up with what we wanted to do in time for the architect to modify the plan and to create an opening in the gallery so that this structure could come all the way up, and the upper part of the roof would be in the main hall. That means that when visitors came into the main hall for their cup of coffee or to sit down, it was a bit like a spider's web, you know. You would capture them and they would say, "What's that?" And they would and we kept a lot of the roof open so that they could see inside to the internal structure. And so then it was time to create the painted ceiling. So we divided the painted ceiling up into about 8 sections, and each section was a 2-week workshop that we conducted in a still standing masonry synagogue in different locations across the length and breadth of Poland. So in Warsaw, Wrocław, Sejna, in Szczebrzeszyn, in Kazimierz Dolna, in Kazimierz Krakow, and just really, and for the students to be actually creating a panel of the painted wooden synagogue in an existing standing masonry synagogue was an incredible experience. And this is the result. And so, which is really fabulous, absolutely fabulous. Now, the Bema, the reader's platform in the middle, is actually 100% scale, and it was created in exactly the same way. And so you get a little bit of a sense of it. And then we have multimedia presentation on the lectern, which explains what all the symbolism is and that kind of thing. But my favorite is the kids, because we have a little cushion for the kids that have two straps, and they wear it, they're like little turtles, wearing their house on their back. But when they come to this area, we encourage them just to lie down and to, look at the ceiling. And I have a feeling for some of these kids, it'll be the single most memorable experience of their museum experience of their childhood. Now, we are very consistent within the exhibition in keeping our visitors in the moment. And we only use sources from the period in the period. However, we wanted to communicate the process by which we created this incredible structure and the materials that we used for it. But that we do on the upper level in the main hall. And we have a glass ledge that goes all the way around. But I was astonished to see one kid showing another kid what is going on with this roof, and see a little kid looking at a map to see where these wooden synagogues were. So even kids, you would think that kids need somehow or other something more spectacular, something more digital, but actually it's not the case at all. So I think what I'm going to do is just very briefly give you a sense of the rest of the exhibition, because I wanted to focus today more on heritage, on tangible, intangible, and a folklorist perspective. But I'll just very, very briefly give you a little bit of a sense of where we go from that early modern period. So at the end of the 18th century, in 1772, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was quite decentralized. It was what was called a republic of nobles, had a very weak army, had a weak king, and Prussia, Russia, and Austria decided that this was the perfect moment to each take a piece of the royal cake, to divide up the map of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and each take a part. And so our long 19th century is essentially the story of what happened in each of the parts, each of the three parts that were taken over by the Kingdom of Prussia and by the Russian and Austrian empires. And we call this Encounters with Modernity. And I think, a hallmark of our approach is that we look not only at the geopolitical situation, at the legal situation, but also at everyday life. We look at memoirs, and we especially look also at women's experience. And we take, for example, the Jewish wedding and its transformations over the whole period as a way of trying to understand how ordinary people in their everyday lives were affected by the new laws and new circumstances and conditions of now living within these two empires and the Kingdom of Prussia. We also work with the absence of objects for communicating a very important development, which was the modern yeshiva. We created a beautiful scenography and a computer, but we also painted live actors and filmed them as a way of conveying the development of organized responses to encounters with modernity, which means the Jewish Enlightenment, the modern yeshiva, and also Hasidism. We come to the middle of the century, and it really is the beginning of the story of industrialization, which we convey in a very beautiful multimedia, intuitive format without words, but only with images that we've animated, and the rise of modern Hebrew and Yiddish culture and new modern Jewish social and political movements. With World War I, we have the establishment of the Second Polish Republic. This year, well, that is to say last year, 2018, was the 100th anniversary. It's a very short period. It's just the 20s and 30s, but it's a very vibrant period. It's a period of economic hardship. It's a period of rising anti-Semitism, but it's also a period of extraordinary political energy, extraordinary cultural creativity in Yiddish and in the Polish language, and with a great sense of, if you will, possibility, but at the same time, uncertainty. Now, I sort of want to share one little moment in this interwar years gallery, we divided it up thematically into politics, culture, growing up, and daily life. And in growing up, we go all the way from childhood and the family through the child's autonomous world of play to the school system to adolescence and their youth movements and youth groups and clubs. But it was in the courtyard of child's autonomous play that I had the opportunity to find a place for my father. So what happened was that what I wanted to communicate was kids made their own toys, and they made them out of nothing. They made them out of newspaper, string, tin, rubber, branches, and they threw them away because they would just make them and then throw them away and make them again. That was and the idea of buying toys. My father doesn't ever remember ever that his family ever bought him a toy. He made all his own toys. And in the late 60s, like 68, 69, I did a survey of Yiddish folklore in Canada for the Canadian National Museum, for their Center for Folk Culture. And one of the things I did was I got my father to make all the toys he could remember from his childhood. Everything. And he taught me how to make them, so I know how to make them too. And I documented them all, of course. And I had to make a set for the Canadian Museum. And in Ottawa, I had to make a set for YIVO. And so when it came time to develop this area, I said, look, the whole idea here is I want our children, the children who are coming, I want them to make these toys. So we developed a table that has drawers, paper, string, whatever, and then I made these toys. And in the very middle is my father with my favorite toy, which is it's actually a bark horn is what it's called in England, in the UK. What it is he called a trompete, which would be a trumpet, or a shofar, a ram's horn. And apparently the Polish peasants used to make them, but the huge ones that when you blew into them, they made an enormous sound. But as we know, a lot of those old instruments, as they devolve, they become children's toys, essentially. So in any event, there's a little mouse made out of a hanky. I actually have some hankies. I can demonstrate this later if anybody's interested, how to make a mouse out of a hanky. And then everyday life across the length and breadth of Poland. And so finally, ultimately, we come to 1939, September 1st. And this is one of 7 galleries in our historical narrative, and it is the gallery dedicated to the Holocaust. And it is here that we really develop, I think, the approach that we use is very important. And that is that it's very important for us that our visitors not anticipate the Holocaust or look at the 1,000-year history of Jews through the lens of the Holocaust. This is extremely important. So we did everything we could to pull back on that kind of teleological drive to the Holocaust. And so when you look down the street, what you see are people looking up. And the question is, what are they looking up at? They're looking up at the bombing of Warsaw during the first week of September 1939. This is the American ambassador to Poland and his staff standing outside the American embassy getting ready to evacuate. And it's only when you turn the corner that you actually see what they're looking up at. And so the Holocaust Gallery is set within the borders of occupied Poland. That means to say within the borders of what had been the Second Polish Republic. And in fact, all the way through the exhibition, the story unfolds within the borders of whatever is Poland at that time, and the Holocaust Gallery is no exception. Now we, using our approach, which is stay in the moment of the story, don't anticipate what's going to happen next, keep the horizon forward, if you will, the distance between where you are in the moment and what's going to happen next, keep it very, very shallow. And as the visitor walks through the story, the future is never very far away, but the past gets deeper, 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 deeper. So it's if it works, it's a very special experience. And we were able to do that for one very particular reason. So this is a map that shows you the Warsaw Ghetto in the city of Warsaw. And what's important here is that during the interwar years, a third of the population of the city was Jewish. And the area that was allocated for the ghetto represented about between 2 and 3% of the territory of the city. and a third of the population and an additional 100,000 Jews were squeezed into that area. So you had 8 to 9 people in a room. So it was a very, very, very compressed, very, very, very crowded area. And one of the most extraordinary and exceptional aspects of the story of the Warsaw Ghetto, which is, if you will, for us, the culmination of the process of separation and isolation, and we take the ghetto as a culmination, and we take the Warsaw Ghetto as our pars pro toto, is that the gentleman on the left, Emanuel Ringelblum, he was a labor Zionist, he was a social activist, and he was an historian. And he created a team of about between 40 and 60 people who created a secret archive of everything that was going on in the Warsaw Ghetto. They collected diaries, letters, ration cards, candy wrappers, everything, posters, announcements, reports. They gathered everything. And the man on the right, Chenyakov, was the head of the Jewish Council, the Judenrat, that the Germans had established to run the ghetto and to carry out their orders. And so what we do here is we draw from their diaries, and we quote from their diaries, Ringelblum in Yiddish, Chenyakov in Polish, always in the English translation, and they accompany our visitors through this story, and it's always point, counterpoint. It's a double-voiced narrative. But what's critically important is the materials that we have to work with, because during the Great Deportation, when this team, and there's now a film, Who Will Write Our History, which is about this archive, during the Great Deportation, when they realized that they wouldn't survive, they packed the archive up into those tin boxes and they buried them. And then a few weeks before the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, a year later, when they realized it was absolutely the end, those that were still in the ghetto packed up the rest of the archive and put it into milk cans. And so there was a second cache. And it was extraordinary that very shortly after the war ended, 3 of the team that survived went out into the rubble of the ghetto. And you can imagine there are no streets there. How do you find anything? And they located the first cache, which were the tin boxes, and they dug them up. But the second cache was found in the 1950s when they were digging foundations, and the earth-moving equipment revealed these milk cans. And at first, some of the workers, they thought the milk cans were of value. They wanted to throw out what was inside. And apparently, the foreman on the crew said, no, this looks like Jewish stuff. We should give it to the Jewish Historical Institute. And they did. And it's said that there's a third cache, but we've never found it. And it was thought that it was under the Chinese embassy in Warsaw. But we can start to speculate there. And they actually let us do some excavating. We could never, it was never possible to find it. And there's even the thought that maybe there wasn't. So we look at Polish-Jewish relations during this period, again, a spectrum of relations. And then there were those who said we should end the story with the Holocaust Gallery, and we said absolutely not, that there's a very, very important post-war story to tell, and we begin it with survivors coming back. So before the war, there were about 3,300,000 Jews living in Poland, and 90% of them were murdered, and most of those who survived in the Soviet Union. They were, quote, saved by deportation, and about 250,000 Jews ended up back in Poland, most of them coming back from the Soviet Union. About 25,000 came out of concentration camps. About 25,000 survived in hiding out of 3,300,000. And the rest were from the Soviet Union, and some stayed in the Soviet Union. And the big question they asked themselves was whether to stay or to leave. And along one wall, we tell the story of staying, and on the other wall, the story of leaving. And of course, being a site-specific museum, we present the history of the creating of the monument to the ghetto heroes. We also present the immediate post-war violence, the Kielce pogrom, which some of you may be familiar with it. It was followed by emigration panic, and more than half the survivors living in Poland at the time left. We also present the story of those who stayed, and what life was like under communism, first under Stalinism, then under communism, everyday life, ordinary people. And we come to the, if you will, last wave of emigration, March 1968. This year is last year, it's only 19 days since last year, so I'm still in 2018. But it's the 50th anniversary of the government-sponsored anti-Semitic campaign, anti-Zionist, ostensibly anti-Semitic campaign of March 68. And by that time, of the approximately 250,000 Jews who had been in Poland right after the war, there were now maybe 20,000 because of these waves of emigration, and more than half of them left as a result of this campaign. But we don't end there. We don't end there either. In fact, we come out into the space of the building and the renewal of Jewish life after the fall of communism, and that would be in 1989. And it's the first time that we use video interviews. There are no survivor interviews in the Holocaust Gallery. There's no post-war material in the Holocaust Gallery. And the first time you get video interviews is from now, because they were about now and they were made now. And the beauty of these interviews are the questions that we asked about 20 Jews living in Poland today. We asked them, is there a future for Jews in Poland? Is there anti-Semitism in Poland? Who can make Jewish culture? Is religion important to you? Is Israel important to you? But the single most surprising question from my point of view, not for my team, but I found unbelievably surprising, because I would never, ever, ever have thought to ask such a question in the United States or Canada. And that question was, did you always know you were Jewish? And it just never occurred to me, having grown up in an intact Jewish family and Jewish community, it just never occurred to me. And when people ask how many Jews are there in Poland today, the best answer is from the chief rabbi of Poland, Rabbi Shudrik. He says, look, we don't know exactly how many Jews there are. All we know is that the number keeps increasing without the birth rate going up. And which gives you a little bit of a sense. And so I like to think of the museum as, in a sense, contributing to the renewal of Jewish life by demonstrating that the reasons why parents, whether they were birth parents or adopted parents, kept that knowledge from their children, the reasons were fear and shame. And I like to think that the museum is a way of dispelling that fear and that shame, and that the museum provides a very rich reservoir of possibilities for what it might mean to be a young Jewish person in Poland today. But it's not the absolute end, because we want to create in our circulation space in the middle of the exhibition an area dedicated to Jews who left Poland. And a way for me to convey to you what that means is, there were these hometown societies that immigrants formed, and my father's hometown society, they had branches. There was, his is from the Opatów, or Opt in Yiddish, and the Opters had a branch in New York, and a branch in Tel Aviv, and a branch in Latin America, and a branch in Toronto. And my father, when he was already in his 90s, he said, basically they gave interest-free loans, they sold cemetery plots, they could all be buried together. My father said, there's like 9 of us left, it's over. But sure enough, somebody from the younger generation decided to revive this society, this hometown society, this Landsmannschaft. And I get a message, of course I joined, and I get a message, and it says, on this Sunday, we want everybody from Opatów, everybody from Opt, to come together for a group photograph. 90 people turned up, including infants. And I thought that was absolutely exceptional, that the 5th generation should still care and identify with the place from which their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents came. And so we want to really capture the legacy of Polish Jews and the life that Jews created when they actually left Poland. And so what I'm hoping is that you'll come. That you'll come to Poland and you'll come to POLIN Museum, because we would love to welcome you. Thank you. So I know that some people have to leave. It's a lunchtime thing, but so please feel free to do so. And those who would like to stay for a couple of questions, with pleasure. Yeah.
Hang on just one second.
So the part of what was then Poland, which is now Western Ukraine, was Eastern Galicia. A lot of people were killed during the Holocaust in the small towns or brought together for various ways. Does the museum go into any of that experience?
I would say that, I think there's actually a bias in the scholarship that is being rectified, because the scholarship and the public perception of the Holocaust is largely a story of what went on in the General Gouvernement, meaning in the death camps. And that the story of the area that was first occupied by the Soviets and then occupied by the Germans when they pushed the Soviets out, which is the story of the Einsatzgruppen, of the death squads, and of the mass killings in pits, not in death camps, not with gas, it was direct murder, literally through shooting. That is the story that's now really being told. It's a very, very important area, because it's also very, very important in terms of Polish violence against Jews, because it's in those circumstances when Jews are not in ghettos and not in death camps, but are somehow in this much more, I would say, loosely controlled situation, that you get some of the really worst violence of neighbors. So we actually don't, well, I'll tell you what we do, actually. So what we do is this. We have a section that basically deals with the Barbarossa campaign, which is that. It's the Barbarossa campaign is the German invasion and the pushing out of the Soviets. And what we do is, the way that we handle it is by presenting Jedwabne, the pogrom in Jedwabne, the pogrom in Lvov, and a map that's showing many, many other pogroms in this period in the summer of 41. And then what we do is we do a pars pro toto, and we present in detail Ponara. And it stands in for that period of basically mass murder, but with its very specific character in this in that region. So we do, yeah. The answer is yes. Exactly. Exactly. Yes.
Hi, this is more of a comment than a question, because I wanted to say I've been to POLIN Museum, and I am absolutely your target audience, and I congratulate you. I think you've succeeded so perfectly. I also have a little anecdote to go with this, but as someone who is an American Jew, second generation, 4 parents born from what was formerly the Commonwealth of Poland, 2 of them from what is still Poland, and one who lost all her family in a Warsaw suburb. We don't even know if they made it to the ghetto, and had a cousin who survived Auschwitz. No one from my family ever went back to Poland. In my 50s, I had the opportunity to go to a conference in Krakow, and I decided it was time to do this, and that I would go to Warsaw as well. Fortunately, I have a master's degree in folklore and a PhD in American Studies. I work here at the library, and I had the opportunity to hear Dr. Kirshenblatt-Gimblett talk about her exhibit before it opened, so I knew I was going to the POLIN Museum. What I did not know is I was going there every day I was in Warsaw. Back, and I still was not able to absorb it all, and for me personally, this was part of a really life-changing experience, which was to understand that I am Polish. My family thought Poland was the place where they killed people, and that's how I was brought up. And it really had a tremendous impact on me. I went in 2016. So I want to thank you for that. And then my anecdote is, strangely, I happened to end up in Warsaw in the same time period that NATO was there. Unbeknownst to me, I came from Washington, D.C. along with Barack Obama. And as a result, lots of street closures, other things. But strangely, on the 3rd day I was at the museum, towards the end of the day, I saw Dr. Kirshenblatt-Gimblett in the museum, in the hallway. And I recognized her immediately, told my spouse, oh my God, that's BKG. She designed the exhibit. And she was walking out with a group of what must have been dignitaries, and then she came back in by herself. I don't know if you'll remember this, because so many people talk to you, but I walked up to her and said, hi, excuse me, but I'm a folklorist, and I need to tell you I recognize you. This is fabulous. You listened to me very politely for a few minutes, thanked me for the praise I heaped upon you, and then you politely excused yourself. 10 minutes later, I discovered her giving a tour to Justin Trudeau in the exhibit. And I have on my phone here pictures of her and Justin Trudeau in the Grodzhvich synagogue.
Oh my God, you gotta
and
take
so I thought you would all appreciate that little. So she is very important in Poland as well.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
Oh, that's phenomenal. Thank you so much. Thank you.
So I'll follow Susan with a small anecdote and then a question. The anecdote is that my father's father was from Bialystok, and I'm not in one of those families where nobody ever went back, because my father did go back to Poland and was knocked out just by being there. And I can only imagine, if he were alive today, what he would feel seeing this museum. It just looks incredible, and I think he would be knocked over by it. And the question is, I wonder if and this is a very specific question, so forgive me, but I wonder if in the Holocaust gallery there's any reference to the human starvation study that was done
Yes.
in the hospital.
Yes, there's a whole section. Actually, one section of the Warsaw Ghetto presentation is specifically on hunger disease.
Okay.
Actually, it's a section on how doctors try to cope with impossible conditions, and there are three aspects of it. Well, one is typhus, and the other is starvation. And that hunger study, which incidentally is full text online. You'll find it's in Polish, but the full
Yes.
text is online.
My father edited the English translation of it, called Hunger Disease. His name is Myron Winnick, and he was
Yes,
the editor
I
of that
know.
book.
Yes. It's really incredible because it's sort of in the face of when you can't do anything about it, you study it.
Right, exactly. And the story is amazing as well. I don't know if you know the story of the stamp collection, but there was a Gestapo guy who was a stamp collector, and one of the doctors was a stamp collector. And that was the way they got some of the equipment, was that the Gestapo guy wanted stamps from the Jewish doctor and was willing to help him out with certain equipment that they didn't otherwise have.
Amazing.
I'll be in
Okay,
touch with
we'll be
you
in touch.
privately.
Great. Thank you.
This was just incredible. My connection to my Polish Jewish ancestors is completely lost, but my partner has maintained this tremendous connection through the village of Sochacin. And she, at this very moment, is out in Memphis with her cousin, putting together a book about the memories of their family from Sochacin and how they came to the U.S., which fortunately was in the 20s for many of them. And there's a rededication of the Jewish cemetery planned for this spring. And now I know we can go and spend a week or two at the POLIN Museum. So thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. You know, just a comment, and that is, I think that the Pauline Museum, like the wonderful new National Museum of African American History and Culture, is a new kind of museum in the sense that these are museums where visitors spend a lot of time, if they expect to. I mean, I think one of the issues is expectations, because often visitors expect in any museum that 2 hours is more than enough, maybe only an hour. And then they discover that they're there, it's 3 hours already, 4 hours, and they're not finished. So what's happening is that what they call dwell time, or the length of the visit, it's a very, very different situation. It's different from going to see a temporary exhibition, an art exhibition. People are spending like the whole day, several days. They're coming back over and over again. It's something different from, I think, what we've seen before. I think of it also for the Holocaust Museum as well. And even though we do offer a 2-hour tour, everybody says it's frustrating that they didn't feel they could see everything. Of course, you can't quote see everything anyway. You got to make choices. But the idea that I was just checking TripAdvisor the other day, and all these people on TripAdvisor are advising each other, allow a whole day, not less than 3 hours, 4 hours is the minimum, and they're actually telling each other that this is not a 2-hour visit. So I do appreciate that. I mean, we had one guy who came for a whole week, and he spent 1 day in each gallery. You know, that's very dedicated. I'm not suggesting that everybody do that, but definitely. And also, there's a very rich cultural and educational and public programs and temporary exhibitions, and it's an educational and cultural center, so, you know, it's doing all kinds of other things. It isn't just, I mean, I worked on the permanent exhibition, which is so defining of the museum, but the museum is much more than that. I think there's a question here.
been such a revelation to me in many ways, but one of them is how you've changed the face of modern museums. I was a Smithsonian Fellow last year. That's exactly what they're trying to do, is become more relevant. And I teach ESL students. You ask them, have any of you ever been to a museum? Nothing. They have to go on a field trip. It's obligatory in my class. I can't tell you I have to drag them there. And afterwards they write to me about how they've been living in America for 6 years and they learned more in one day than they did, etc. So you are really in the forefront, the cutting edge of the idea of museum and the visitor, which is a question of finding identity more than learning and knowledge and interactive games and playing. So really.
But you know, it's interesting. Museum going isn't something to assume. But as a child, my parents never took me to a museum. It was only as a school group. But my parents never. I went by myself because of my strange, Orthodox moment. But I know that's a crazy way to actually come to love museums, but that's how it happened. But my parents never took me. And now later, of course, they would read and they would go, but not during my childhood. And I have a feeling that that's true for. There's whole sections of society where they're not comfortable in museums. They don't think that museums are for them. And I think that museums are making a huge effort to somehow reach out and become more accessible and more welcoming. And I think it's a huge opportunity. So it's great that you take them.
Also done is tapped into the idea of narrative. I'm writing my doctorate on Holocaust memoir and transgenerational trauma, and I got kicked out of the composition department. I had to do it as literature. Because it's neither history, it's kind of fiction, it isn't at all. So I'm coming in between two stools and I don't
Understood. Understood.
Really,
Thank
the
you.
idea of using narrative is very important.
Thank
you
you.
so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Looks like it's exhaustive and exhausting. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. February 21st is our next Botkin lecture on folklore and aging by John Kay from Indiana University. Please come back then. And thank you again, Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett, for a wonderful talk.